All right, so we're going to talk about the iPhone 15 Pro Max. Here we are. This is 5x zoom. And then we pull back a little bit. And then we're about to zoom back all the way. This is beyond 5x. That's the little dish push in. And now we go all the way back to the 0.5. 0.5 to the 5. This is insane. So let's talk about the iPhone 5X Pro Max versus 35 millimeter. So what we're talking about today, I happened to get an iPhone like a day before everybody else to play with, which is one of the perks of writing tech reviews. And here we are, all of this footage here shot with the iPhone. Now, if you notice, I'm a little red in the shadows. It's going to disappear here in a sec. I got rid of it. You just saw it disappear. And the reason why I was a little bit too red in those shadows is a lot of digital imagery does that. Taking off the little shadow red is one of the tricks we do in pretty much everything we grade digitally. But I have to say, like, looking at this footage, the fact that the iPhone 15 Pro Max does this and does this handheld and is able to do this internal stabilization. This is one of my students, Celine Almiron. She is operating this camera just by hand and shooting straight into a USB-C drive. It is the new log format, and we're getting this beautiful stuff. That's Sam and Sam. Those gentlemen are both named Sam, and we're seeing sort of what the log can do for us and sort of the extreme limits. And then I wanted to shoot a side-by-side with the iPhone and 35mm because coincidentally I happened to be teaching 35mm class that day, which happens. So this is a zoom dolly with the 15X. I actually have to say I was expecting the zoom dolly to be much worse on the 15X. Obviously, our framing's not perfect because we were optimizing for the 35. I wasn't expecting the zoom to be as smooth as it was. You still get that little pop when it switches from lens to lens, but I have to say, much more impressive. Now, I'm not color correcting this shot at all, and this is shot with Filmic Pro in log, and the reason why I left it sort of uncorrected is I feel like the Filmic Pro log pops a little bit more in color, especially looking at that blue. It was oversaturated compared to what I was really looking for. Right now, with the 15 Pro Max, I feel like you want to shoot your log on Blackmagic camera. There's some other stuff, most of the other stuff we see, like the BTS stuff, Celine was using the Blackmagic camera, and I feel like that stuff, the color rendition is much better. This is switched to the Blackmagic camera, warmed it up a little bit. I have to say, that zoom is way smoother than I thought it would be. I don't think you're ever going to get to the point where you're like, this is the perfect zoom. But I do feel like we did much better zoom dollies here than I necessarily thought we were going to be able to do on a phone camera. And I feel like there's maybe the possibility of being able to practice enough to get something usable from this, which is absolutely fascinating. Well, here I want to talk about some other stuff with the camera. I feel like the log is wonderful. We're getting nice flesh tones. I feel like my flesh tones are clumping up a little bit, and I feel like that's probably, I feel like the exposure is struggling to deal with the backlight. I think we got a lot better skin tones when we don't have the backlight quite so much, but the skin tones aren't terrible. We can see it start to fall off a little bit. The backlight's in frame. We did that on purpose. We'll talk about why when we get to the 35mm, but you're starting to see a little bit of like the veiling halo effect and how that affects some of the rest of the imagery. You just saw a little bump of rolling shutter effect there at the end. And those bumps you see are when the iPhone's switching from lens to lens. Honestly, that moment is probably the best of the zoom dolly that we're going to get out of the iPhone 15 Pro Max. I think it's pretty, frankly, impressive that it was able to do it at all. So we're looking at some more BTS footage here. And now we're on to our 35mm. So this is our 35mm shot. It's a straight scan. This is 5219, and we're pulling the zoom by hand. We had a Microforce. The Microforce was being finicky, as sometimes happens with older film stuff. So we have a beautiful, smooth, perfect take on the Microforce. And then our film takes are all pulled by hand, which, frankly, the pulled by hand takes end up looking reasonably close. You see, that's our attempt. That's the Microforce not working. So here you're going to see it pulled by hand. It's not going to be quite as perfect as a Microforce would have been, but a pretty nice little move there while it lined up there at the beginning, and then it sort of, the speed didn't quite match up. Now, why did I have a big backlight in frame? Well, I want you to look at the top and the bottom of the frame. I know this is an iPhone review, but let's learn a little bit about 35. So that thing you're seeing at the top and the bottom of the frame where it burns out like that's called a gate flare. And that is the light hitting the edge of the gate and burning out, and it burns out into the top and the bottom of the frame. because it's burning both at the same time. It is burning your the next frame, because film frames are next to each other, and you can see that here. And this is one of the reasons why a lot of film shoots, you're going to see some black wrap at the edge of the lens. You're really trying to avoid having a light travel right over the edge of the gate. Not really a problem with the top and bottom, because those are often matted out in film unless you're shooting anamorphic. More of a struggle with the side to side, but when you've got that light crossing the gate, you really see it. I have to say, film still nicer skin tones than digital, but that's film. That's like the deal. And color reproduction. But the iPhone holds up surprisingly well. We're going to do a split screen here in a second. It's not the world's best split screen. You're going to use 35 and you're going to use the iPhone Pro Max for different jobs. You know what I mean? Like a 35 millimeter job, you're probably shooting a whole feature on 35 or a music video, and you're trying to get the aesthetic of the film you couldn't get otherwise. You're probably getting some archival benefits out of the fact that the film will still be here in 500 years. There's a bunch of different variables that go into it. But I wanted to go ahead and do a side-by-side. Now, right now, obviously, I've thrown up the side-by-side sort of frustratingly for some, I think, with my Filmic Pro. I have to say, I'm surprised at how good the iPhone 15 Pro Max looks in a side-by-side with 35mm film. I mean, we're going to get a different noise profile, obviously. That's inevitable. Digital, you're going to have more noise in the shadows. Film, you're going to have more noise in the midtones and not going to have noise in the shadows. You can really see that when you look at those black overalls. You start to see noise in the black overalls on the digital, but we're not really seeing noise there in the film. 5219, you're not going to see a lot of noise anyway. The flare characteristics are obviously very different. It's a Panavision 17.5 to 75 on the left, and then it's the 3 prime lenses of the 15 Pro Max sort of popping together on the right. Now on the right, this is the Blackmagic camera compared to the 35mm. I feel like there is that thing. I wonder if further tests would say we were maybe a little overexposed on Tatiana's face. Thank you so much for sitting in, Tatiana. I really appreciate it. Because I'm seeing, like, the texture is clumping up a little bit in her face, and I wonder if we were a little too bright and we would have been happier letting the face go a little dark and we would have gotten a little more detail back out of it. I'm not quite 100% sure. I mean, look, all of this, every camera, yeah, because you see when it gets darker, we get a little bit of that texture back. Every camera you shoot, it's all a testing process. And you test as much as you can until you feel like, ooh, I have a complete handle on this. I know what I'm doing, and if I test it, I get the things I want. But kind of surprising. I wasn't expecting to feel so good about iPhone 15 Pro Max versus 35mm. And now we're back, and this is still just some iPhone Pro Max stuff. I really like, with this log footage, how much detail we get. The reason why I wanted to include the shots, we get all of this amazing detail in these very dark subjects. So we've got black lens on black tripod head, and I felt like we were able, whereas in a traditional digital camera, I would have just assumed all that detail was lost and chunky and gone. I was actually pretty quickly able to dig in there. You see my black Panavision hat. I've got nice texture on that. My black Panavision hat has nice texture versus the black curtain behind it. So taking a little bit of the overly saturated shadows out. Yeah, it's kind of an impressive beast. Look, filmmakers should all update anyway, because the USB-C is going to change everything. You can shoot straight to a USB-C drive, which is what we're shooting to now, formatted to exFAT. When you're done, plug it into a computer, you just get so much more runtime and so much easier workflow that, if you're a filmmaker in the iPhone ecosystem, you should consider jumping to 15 sooner than later. If you're debating it, the USB-C is the real killer app. But I gotta say, look at those great skin tones. That's a Mecca. Tag him in the article. His skin tones are fantastic in both directions, sort of the underlit, backlit skin tones here. Yeah, guys. iPhone Pro Max versus 35mm. That is me. Probably disorienting to see me talking and hearing my voice, but they're not in sync. I think, that's all I've got to say on this. That is the iPhone 15 Pro Max versus 35mm. Oh, I teach 35mm classes. They're available to the public in the summer. Brooklyn35mm.com if you want to learn to shoot 35mm. Thank you very much.